title my parents faked my death to collect insurance. I walked into my own funeral teaser. I was backpacking in Thailand when a typhoon hit. I lost my phone for 3 weeks. When I finally got Wi-Fi, I had 47 missed calls and a news article about my tragic death. My parents had already cashed a $750,000 policy. I booked the next flight home and walked into the church during my own eulogy and what I saw in the front row. My name is Avery Broussard, and I am 29 years old. I was doing field research in rural Thailand when a Category 4 typhoon washed away the roads, the cell towers, and my gear. I survived for 3 weeks in a remote village helping locals dig out of the mud. When I finally made it to the U.S. consulate in Bangkok to request an emergency travel document, the clerk took one look at his computer screen, reached for a pair of heavy metal shears, and cut my passport right down the middle. "The system says you are deceased, ma'am." This is a fraudulent document. My parents hadn't just assumed I drowned. They had a death certificate issued within 2 weeks to cash out a $750,000 life insurance policy. A few weeks later, I booked a flight home and walked into a historic Catholic church in the French Quarter during my own eulogy, and what I saw my mother doing at the pulpit made my blood run cold. Before I tell you how I tore my family's lies apart, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge, but only if this story truly speaks to you, and drop your age in the comments. I want to know who is listening to this right now. Now let me take you back to that freezing consulate room in Bangkok, the exact moment I realized my own family had legally erased my existence. "Excuse me, what did you just do?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, scraping against the dry, overconditioned air of the embassy. The clerk, a man with a tired face and a blue lanyard, slid the 2 halves of my dark passport back under the thick partition. "A consular report of death abroad was filed 14 days ago. Your social security number is flagged. I have to confiscate invalid identity documents." I stared at the severed booklet. My photo smiled back at me, split neatly down the bridge of my nose. "I am standing right in front of you. I am breathing. I have a pulse. Look at my face." He didn't look at my face. He looked back at his monitor. "The affidavit was signed by your legal next of kin, Ms. Broussard. If that is your name, security will need to escort you to a holding area while we verify your status." I had spent the last 21 days knee-deep in floodwaters. The typhoon had hit the northern provinces without warning. The river crested its banks in the middle of the night, taking my ecological testing equipment, my phone, and the only bridge connecting our research site to the main highway. For 3 weeks, I slept on a woven mat in a Buddhist temple, rationing boiled rice and bottled water, dreaming of home. I missed the suffocating August heat of the Atchafalaya Basin. I missed the sharp roasted smell of chicory coffee brewing in my kitchen. I spent my days hauling debris out of local shops, assuming my family back in Louisiana was frantic with worry. I imagined my father Beau pacing our porch calling the State Department every hour. I imagined my mother Julianne weeping on the local news begging for search parties. I had finally hitched a ride in the back of a supply truck to Chiang Mai. The first thing I did when I found a working computer at a youth hostel was open my email to send a proof-of-life message. Instead, I found a Google alert for my own name. The Baton Rouge Advocate had published an article. Local wetlands ecologist Avery Broussard presumed dead in Asian flood. That alone made sense. The lack of communication, the disaster zone. But the timeline did not. The U.S. government does not declare a missing American citizen dead in 2 weeks just because the power goes out. You need a body, or you need a family member willing to submit sworn fabricated evidence to a federal judge to accelerate the process. Standing in the consulate, the reality of what my parents had done slammed into my chest. They hadn't waited. They hadn't searched. They had sprinted to the courthouse to cash me out. "Call them," I demanded, pressing my hands flat against the fiberglass counter. "Call the Baton Rouge police. Call my father. Call anyone." "Ma'am, please step back from the window," the clerk said, picking up his desk phone. The raw exhaustion of the last month boiled over into a dark, blinding fury. I slammed my fist into the thick partition. The fiberglass didn't break, but the skin across my knuckles split open. A smear of bright red blood marked the clear barrier. "I am alive." I screamed it. my voice echoing off the sterile walls, drawing the stares of dozens of tourists waiting for visa renewals. "You call my mother right now and tell her I'm alive." 2 armed security guards grabbed my arms, hauling me backward. I fought them, my boots slipping on the polished tile. I kicked and thrashed, tears of pure rage burning my eyes as they dragged me down a narrow hallway toward a windowless detention room. I wasn't just a survivor of a natural disaster anymore. I was a ghost trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare engineered by the very people who gave me life. I sat on a molded plastic chair in a windowless detention room at the back of the consulate. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low electric hum that made my teeth ache. I wrapped a rough brown paper towel around my knuckles to stop the bleeding from where I had struck the fiberglass partition. A junior consular officer stood by the door holding a clipboard. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe bureaucratic irritation. I needed a screen. I needed proof. I looked up at him and kept my voice low and steady. I convinced him to slide his secured laptop across the metal table. I promised I only needed 2 minutes to pull up my bank statements. If I could show him a transaction made the day before the typhoon hit the coast, I could prove I was in the country and active. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I navigated to the login portal for my local branch back home, the St. Tammany Parish Credit Union. I typed my username and my password. I waited for the dashboard to load. Instead of my checking balance, a gray banner slashed across the screen. "Access denied. Account frozen. Pending estate probate." I stared at those words. Estate probate. Louisiana does not operate like the rest of the country. We run on a strict variation of the Napoleonic Code. Our inheritance laws are ancient, rigid, and unforgiving. When someone dies, accounts do not just pass quietly into the night. A succession must be formally opened in a parish courthouse. A judge has to sign a judgment of possession. An executor has to be legally appointed to seize control of the assets. It is a grueling legal mechanism designed to protect wealth, and someone had triggered that mechanism for my life. I asked the officer to let me use his desk phone. I dialed the international exit code and the 10 digits of my local branch. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. It was Danielle, a woman I sat next to in high school biology, who had worked as a branch manager there for years. I told her it was Avery. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. A long, suffocating pause followed. Danielle whispered my name, as if she had just seen a ghost walk through the bank doors. She told me she had attended my memorial service a few days prior. She offered her condolences to me for my own death, her voice shaking with confusion. I cut through the pleasantries and demanded to know why my accounts were locked in probate. Danielle hesitated. She explained that my mother, Julianne, had marched into the branch with a certified death certificate and a court order naming her the executor of my estate. My mother had drained my checking and savings accounts to the last cent. But then Danielle dropped a detail that made the air in the holding room turn to ice. My mother had not just taken my savings. She had deposited a check from a life insurance payout, a payout for $750,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $750,000. I did not have a standard family life insurance policy. I am a wetlands ecologist. 2 years ago, I secured a large federal grant to conduct high-risk environmental testing deep in the Atchafalaya Basin and overseas. The federal grant board mandated a key person insurance policy. It is a specific corporate safety net designed to protect the financial investment of the research if the lead scientist dies in the field. When I filled out the paperwork at 27 years old, I hastily listed my parents as the default beneficiaries. I never updated the forms because I never imagined my own blood would view my death as a lottery ticket. The timeline looped in my head, tightening like a snare. You do not get a $750,000 insurance payout in 2 weeks without a body. Insurance fraud divisions investigate policies of that size for months. They require forensic evidence. They require dental records. My father, Beau, runs a struggling crawfish boat. My mother sells luxury real estate. Neither of them possess the legal finesse to expedite an international death claim and bypass a federal fraud investigation. But my brother did. Lucas, the golden child of the Broussard family. He took the bar exam 3 times and failed it every single time. He never became the high-powered attorney my mother bragged he would be. He recently tried to open a boutique bourbon distillery in New Orleans, a venture he funded through shadowy private equity loans. Lucas knew the law just well enough to manipulate it. He knew the exact loopholes in the Louisiana probate system. He knew how to bribe a local Thai official to sign a blind affidavit identifying an unrecognizable flood victim. He knew how to source and submit forged dental records to the American embassy. He orchestrated the entire illusion. The panic that had consumed me since I walked into the consulate evaporated. It was replaced by a venomous mechanical clarity. My mother had not been paralyzed by grief. She had been busy organizing a heist. While I was drinking rainwater and pulling debris off the bodies of strangers in a foreign jungle, my family was sitting in air-conditioned offices, forging my signature, transferring my wealth, and dividing the spoils of my fabricated demise. I hung up the phone. I handed the laptop back to the consular officer. I told him to process my emergency travel document immediately. I needed to get to the airport. I walked out into the main waiting area of the embassy. A young American backpacker from Colorado was sitting near the vending machines looking bored as he waited for a visa extension. I sat down next to him. I showed him my university credentials online. I explained that I had been robbed during the typhoon and needed to book a flight to New Orleans tonight. I offered to wire him double the cost of the ticket the moment I regained access to my institutional research funds. He looked at my bruised knuckles, my mud-stained clothes, and the sheer unblinking intensity in my eyes. He pulled out his credit card without a word. I secured a seat on a red-eye flight leaving Bangkok in 4 hours. I took the temporary emergency travel papers from the consulate clerk. The paper felt flimsy, a fragile proof of life. I walked out into the sweltering Thai heat, hailed a taxi, and headed for the airport. My family thought they had successfully buried the scapegoat. They thought they had secured their fortune and erased their problem. They had no idea that their problem was currently boarding a flight across the Pacific, armed with the truth, and coming straight for their front door. The flight across the Pacific was a blur of recycled air and deep physical ache. I sat in a cramped middle seat for 20 hours. I did not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured my mother standing in a parish courthouse handing over forged documents with a calm and calculated expression. I pictured my brother Lucas drafting fake affidavits to bypass the legal waiting periods. I landed at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport, feeling hollowed out and brittle. Stepping off the jet bridge, the familiar atmosphere of my home state hit me immediately. The terminal carried the distinct scent of stale Abita beer from the concourse bars, the sugary grease of fried dough from the beignet stands, and the metallic tang of damp brass instruments lingering around the live music stages. Under normal circumstances, those smells meant home. Today, they smelled like a crime scene. I walked straight to the Customs and Border Protection checkpoint. I handed the agent my flimsy emergency travel document. I expected a quick stamp. I expected to flag down a taxi and head straight to Baton Rouge to confront my parents. The agent scanned the barcode. His monitor beeped a sharp negative tone. He looked at the screen, typed something rapidly, and looked up at me. His expression hardened into a wall of pure suspicion. He asked me to place my right hand on the fingerprint scanner. I pressed my fingers against the glowing green glass. The machine processed the biometric data. A red warning light flashed on his terminal. He picked up his radio and muttered a numerical code into the receiver. Within seconds, 2 armed Homeland Security officers materialized behind me. They did not ask how my flight was. They instructed me to step out of line. They flanked me, their hands resting near their duty belts, and escorted me away from the bustling terminal into a sterile, restricted corridor. The air grew incredibly cold. They placed me inside a windowless interrogation room. A single metal table bolted to the floor sat in the center. The walls were painted an institutional gray that felt heavy and suffocating. A federal agent walked in holding a thick file. He tossed the folder onto the metal table. He leaned forward and informed me that I was committing a serious federal offense. He accused me of identity theft. According to the United States government database, Avery Broussard perished in a typhoon in Southeast Asia over 3 weeks ago. A federal judge in Louisiana had already signed the death certificate. The State Department had closed the file. The agent told me that whoever I was wearing the face and stealing the fingerprints of a dead woman, and I was facing severe federal charges. I tried to explain the fraud. I told him my family had accelerated the probate process to cash out a key person life insurance policy required by my university research grant. The agent stared at me with blank disbelief. He demanded proof. He demanded I tell him things only the real Avery Broussard would know. I realized then that reversing a legal death decree is not a triumphant cinematic montage. It is a grueling and degrading legal roadblock. I sat in that freezing room and bled my entire history onto the metal table just to prove I had the right to breathe. I recounted the exact layout of my father Beau and his rusted crawfish boat docked in the Atchafalaya Basin. I described the smell of diesel fuel and pluff mud that clung to his work jacket every evening. I detailed my mother Julianne and her desperate climb into Baton Rouge high society, explaining how she sold luxury real estate and wore designer scarves to hide the fact that she grew up starving in the Ninth Ward. I told the federal agents about my older brother Lucas, the golden child who failed the state bar exam 3 separate times and owed money to private lenders for a failing boutique bourbon distillery in the French Quarter. I named my middle school teachers. I recited the specific wetland coordinates of my ecological research sites. I gave them every intimate detail of my existence. The agents took notes. They remained highly skeptical. Bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace, and reversing a certified death requires verifying facts across multiple international and domestic agencies. I was not allowed to leave. For 48 hours I remained detained in that restricted sector of the airport. The physical exhaustion degraded my spirit. I slept on a hard vinyl chair in the corner of the holding room using my thin canvas backpack as a pillow. The bright overhead lights never turned off. The hum of the ventilation system drilled into my skull. When I begged for food, an indifferent guard handed me 2 packets of stale cheese crackers from the break room vending machine and a small paper cup of lukewarm water. I ate the crackers, slowly tasting the salt and the dry dust of the room. Every hour that passed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I felt like a trapped animal while the poachers divided up the pelt. My parents were out there spending my life insurance money. Lucas was paying off his business debts. They were sleeping in soft beds, eating hot meals, and performing the role of the tragic, grieving family. Meanwhile, I was shivering under an air conditioning vent, treated like a criminal imposter in my own hometown. The initial panic of the typhoon and the shock at the consulate burned away. In its place, a dark and dangerous resolve took root. I stopped crying. I stopped asking the guards for updates. I sat up straight on the vinyl chair and stared at the gray wall, visualizing the exact moment I would confront my mother. I mapped out the words I would use. I calculated the precise damage I would inflict upon my brother and his fragile reputation. My family had treated me like a disposable asset. They had weighed the value of my life against a $750,000 payout, and they had chosen the payout. They threw me away for cash. Late on the second day, the heavy metal door finally opened. The lead federal agent walked in holding a single sheet of paper. He looked deeply exhausted. He informed me that they had successfully cross-referenced my biometric data with my university records and contacted a regional supervisor who authorized a temporary clearance. My identity was still a tangled legal mess, but they could no longer hold me on suspicion of identity theft. They granted me a temporary status document. The agent warned me not to leave the state of Louisiana until the probate courts unraveled the fraudulent death certificate. I took the paper from his hand without a word of thanks. I walked out of the holding room past the security checkpoints and finally pushed through the sliding glass doors into the main arrivals terminal. The brutal Louisiana heat hit me instantly. I had not showered in 4 days. My clothes were stiff with dried mud from the Thai floods and stale sweat from the airport detention center. I felt feral. I walked to a row of public charging stations and plugged in the cheap prepaid phone I had purchased during my layover. I connected to the public network and pulled up the local Baton Rouge news site to search for any updates on my own estate. A new article had been posted just a few hours prior. It announced a public memorial service for Avery Broussard, the beloved wetlands ecologist, taking place that very afternoon at a historic Catholic church in the French Quarter. My family was holding my funeral right now. I unhooked my phone from the charging cable. I walked out to the taxi stand, my boots striking the pavement with heavy, deliberate intent. I was going to crash my own wake. I rode in the back of a dented yellow cab from the airport to the French Quarter. The oppressive Louisiana heat pressed against the glass, making the air inside the vehicle feel thick and heavy. I watched the familiar architecture of New Orleans roll past the window, the wrought iron balconies and the crumbling brick facades. I felt entirely disconnected from my own body. I was a ghost returning to a city that had already written my obituary. The cab pulled up to a historic Catholic church on Royal Street. I handed the driver a crumpled bill I had exchanged at the airport and stepped out onto the humid pavement. Outside the church courtyard, the heavy and mournful notes of a brass band played a slow dirge. It was a traditional jazz funeral march, an expensive cultural staple reserved for prominent locals. Next door, under a sprawling white canopy set up for the repast, a premier catering crew was already staging the food. The rich, spicy scent of simmering crawfish étouffée and freshly fried boudin balls hung thick in the stagnant air. I recognized the catering company. They were the most sought-after vendors in Baton Rouge. My family spared no expense to send me off into the afterlife. They were funding this extravagant farewell party with the very life insurance policy they stole from me. The smell of the Cajun spices, a scent that usually meant comfort, and home made bile rise in my throat. I stood at the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. I had not showered in days. My clothes were still stiff with dried mud from the Thai flood zones, and reeked of the stale sweat from the airport detention center. My hair was a tangled, unwashed knot. I placed my hands on the brass handles and pushed hard. The hinges groaned in protest. I stepped into the cool, air-conditioned nave of the church and slipped into the shadows of the back vestibule. The wooden pews were packed tight. I saw local politicians my mother courted, university colleagues I deeply respected, and extended relatives I had not seen in a decade. A sea of black suits and conservative dresses faced the altar. I braced myself. I expected a solemn and suffocating atmosphere. I fully expected to see my father broken his broad shoulders, shaking with sobs. I expected my mother to be leaning heavily against the front pew, devastated by the loss of her youngest child. I expected to feel at least a fraction of guilt for interrupting their mourning process with my sudden chaotic resurrection. Instead, I heard Julianne. My mother stood at the carved marble pulpit. She wore a pristine black designer suit with a high collar and pearls. A wide-brimmed mourning hat shadowed her face, but from my vantage point I had a clear view of her profile. Her eyes were bone-dry. She spoke into the microphone with the polished, rhythmic cadence of the high-end luxury real estate broker she was. She talked about my childhood exploring the bayou and my deep, lifelong passion for the wetlands. She painted a glowing portrait of a devoted, selfless daughter who loved her family above all else. She delivered the lines flawlessly, pacing her breath for maximum emotional impact. It sounded exactly like a rehearsed marketing pitch. Then she executed a pivot so seamless and calculated it made the blood pound in my ears. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium and let out a dramatic, trembling sigh. She told the hushed congregation that my greatest wish in life was to see my family thrive. She claimed I always believed in my older brother Lucas and his visionary entrepreneurial spirit. I stared at the back of Lucas's head in the front row. He had failed the state bar exam 3 separate times. He had been rejected by every traditional bank in the parish when he tried to fund his boutique bourbon distillery. My mother leaned closer to the microphone. She announced that, to honor my memory, the Broussard family was establishing a legacy fund to ensure Lucas could finally launch his business in the Garden District. She actively invited the local business owners and politicians sitting in the pews to speak with Lucas at the repast outside about venture capital opportunities. She was using my funeral as a networking event. She was leveraging my fabricated death to secure investors for her golden child. The life insurance payout was not enough for them. They needed the social capital of a tragic loss to fund Lucas's failing dreams. A dizzying, surreal anger flooded my veins. It washed away my exhaustion. It burned through my fear of the legal mess awaiting me. The sheer audacity of the pitch erased any lingering hesitation I had about causing a scene. I stepped out of the shadows of the vestibule and into the center aisle. My heavy work boots struck the stone floor with a sharp, rhythmic thud. Thud, thud, thud. A few people in the back rows turned around to see who was disrupting the service. I watched their expressions morph from mild annoyance to raw, unfiltered shock. A woman in a black lace dress gasped her hand, flying to her mouth. A man I recognized from the university biology department dropped his program. The whispering started like a low wave moving from the back of the church to the front. I kept my eyes locked on the pulpit. I walked faster, my vision narrowing to a tunnel focused entirely on my mother's face. I was moving too fast. I did not look at where I was stepping. Right near the front pews, a large wooden easel stood displaying a blown-up photograph of my face surrounded by expensive white lilies. My heavy boot caught the thick wooden leg of the stand. I lost my balance and tumbled forward, crashing hard into the floral arrangement. The thick mahogany easel snapped in two with a loud, sharp cracking noise that echoed up into the vaulted ceiling. The lilies scattered across the polished stone tiles. The framed portrait of my smiling face shattered glass spraying across the aisle. I hit the ground hard, my knee taking the brunt of the impact. The sting of public humiliation mixed with my towering rage. I scrambled to my feet, my breathing heavy and ragged. I looked up at the priest standing near the altar, eyes wide with horror, and I let out a harsh, unfiltered curse word that rang through the sacred space. I did not care about the sanctity of the room. I did not care about the optics. I stepped over the broken wood and the crushed white flowers. I marched right up to the steps of the altar. The entire congregation sat paralyzed. Julianne stopped speaking. Her hands gripped the microphone so tight her knuckles turned stark white. Lucas sat frozen in the front pew, wearing a tailored charcoal suit paid for by my death, his jaw hanging open. My father Beau sat next to him, gripping a worn prayer book, like it was a life preserver, his face draining of all color. I pointed a trembling, bruised finger directly at my mother. You could not even wait 30 days to cash me out. My voice ripped through the silence of the church. The guests recoiled. I turned my glare to Lucas, then down to my father. I asked them loudly how much my life was worth on the open market. I asked if $750,000 was enough to cover the distillery debts and still pay for the brass band playing outside. I stood before them, dirty, breathing hard, a living testament to their greed. I waited for my parents to rush forward to embrace their lost daughter, to fall to their knees in relief that I had survived the typhoon. They did not move. They just stared at me, calculating the exact cost of my survival. The echo of my accusation rang through the vaulted ceiling of the sanctuary and hung over the pews. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The entire congregation sat paralyzed, processing the sight of a dead woman standing among the shattered remains of her own memorial wreath. I looked down at the front row. My father dropped his thick, leather-bound hymnal. It slapped hard against the stone tiles, the thin paper pages fluttering wildly before settling near his polished dress shoes. Next to him, my brother Lucas recoiled. He physically backed away from the altar, his shoulders hitting the carved wooden communion rail. He stared at me as if a demon had crawled out of the bayou and dragged itself into the holy space. I stood there waiting for the shock to break. I waited for my father to rush past the broken lilies, pull me into his arms, and weep into my shoulder. I waited for my mother to abandon her spot at the pulpit and fall to her knees in gratitude that her youngest child had survived a catastrophic typhoon. None of that happened. I scanned the faces of the 3 people who shared my blood. I did not see relief. I did not see joy or love or even confusion. I saw naked, unadulterated terror. If you crashed your own funeral and your family looked terrified instead of relieved, what would be your next move? My move was to press the attack. I marched up the remaining steps to the altar, bringing the stench of airport sweat, dried Thai mud, and pure adrenaline right into my mother's personal space. Julianne gripped the edges of the carved wooden podium. Her knuckles were bone white. She wore a pristine black designer suit, smelling of expensive floral perfume that clashed with the grime covering my skin. I asked her again, my voice trembling with a chaotic mix of sorrow and fury. I demanded to know exactly which accounts held the payout from my federal grant policy. I asked Lucas how much of my life insurance money he had already funneled into his failing boutique distillery. I wanted them to admit it in front of the local politicians, the university faculty, and every prominent socialite my mother had invited to this macabre networking event. A low collective murmur began to rise from the pews behind me. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the suffocating heat of a crowded church in the middle of a Louisiana summer. The older women in the congregation, dressed in their Sunday black, simultaneously reached into their purses. A flurry of movement erupted as dozens of paper funeral fans depicting the Virgin Mary began waving furiously back and forth, battling the stifling humidity and the escalating scandal. Whispers filled the sanctuary, thick with southern drawls, questioning my identity, my sanity, and the chaotic scene unfolding on the altar. Julianne evaluated the shifting energy in the room. She realized she was losing control of the narrative. The wealthy investors she had been courting just moments ago were now watching her get interrogated by a feral-looking woman claiming to be her deceased daughter. My mother needed an exit strategy, and she needed one immediately. She did not break down in tears of guilt. She did not attempt to explain the impossible timeline of the death certificate. Instead, Julianne executed a masterful theatrical pivot. She let out a piercing, ragged wail that carried perfectly through the microphone, ensuring every person in the building heard her supposed agony. She clutched a manicured hand over her chest, right above her heart. She swayed on her high heels, her eyelids fluttering shut. With the grace of a stage actress, she collapsed backward, swooning perfectly into Lucas's waiting arms. Lucas caught her, instantly lowering her to the carpeted floor behind the altar. He shouted for someone to call a doctor, claiming the shock of this cruel prank had triggered a medical emergency for his grieving mother. The manipulation worked flawlessly. The congregation erupted into a frantic swarm. Parishioners rushed out of the pews and scrambled up the altar steps, pushing past me to get to Julianne. People I had known since childhood shouldered me aside. A wealthy real estate developer from my mother's firm bumped my shoulder hard, glaring at me with open disgust. They treated me like a violent intruder, a deranged vagrant who had stormed into a sacred space to terrorize a heartbroken family. The narrative had flipped in a matter of seconds. I was no longer the victim of a financial heist. I was the monster ruining a beautiful farewell service. I tried to push my way back toward the pulpit. I wanted to force Lucas to answer me. I wanted to tear the veil off their performance. Before I could take another step, a rough, calloused hand clamped down on my bicep. The grip was tight, bruising, carrying the heavy strength of a man who had spent 40 years hauling traps on a commercial shrimping boat. I looked over my shoulder. It was my father. Beau Broussard did not pull me into a hug. He did not ask if I was hurt or how I had survived the floodwaters in Southeast Asia. He kept his grip secured on my arm, digging his fingers into my muscle. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and anxiety. He told me to stop talking right now. His voice was a harsh, frantic whisper, rough like sandpaper. He did not sound like a relieved parent. He sounded like a cornered animal. I tried to yank my arm away, but his grip held firm. He dragged me away from the chaotic swarm around the pulpit, pulling me forcefully toward the side of the sanctuary. We moved through a heavy wooden door into the dim, quiet isolation of the church sacristy. The room smelled of old incense and damp wood. The heavy door clicked shut, cutting off the loud murmurs of the congregation outside. I stood in the center of the small room, rubbing my bruised arm. I looked at my father, expecting him to finally break character to apologize, to show a shred of paternal relief. Beau was shaking. His broad shoulders trembled, and his face was slick with cold sweat. He paced the short length of the sacristy, running his hands over his face. He turned to me, his expression twisted with panic. He did not ask about my journey. He did not ask about the typhoon. He told me that my sudden resurrection was going to ruin everything. He whispered frantically that the insurance company had already been asking questions. He said the payout had barely cleared the probate accounts, and now I had stormed in and alerted half the parish. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a desperate, ragged plea. He warned me that if I did not leave the church quietly and figure out a way to cover up this mess, I was going to send my mother straight to a federal penitentiary. I stared at the man who had taught me how to navigate the bayou, the man who used to read me stories on the deck of his boat. He was actively begging me to protect a criminal conspiracy that required my permanent erasure. He cared more about saving Julianne from the consequences of her fraud than he cared about the fact that his daughter was standing in front of him, breathing and alive. A cold, hollow realization settled deep in my chest. The crushing weight of the truth finally anchored itself in my mind. I was entirely alone. The people who were supposed to protect me had sold my future to fund their own survival, and they were angry that I had survived to ruin the transaction. Before I could formulate a response, before I could ask him how he could possibly justify trading my life for a distillery investment, a loud, sharp knock echoed against the heavy wooden door of the sacristy. The door pushed open, swinging wide on its iron hinges. The commotion in the main sanctuary had died down, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. Standing in the doorway was not a concerned parishioner or a medical professional checking on my mother. 2 uniformed officers from the Louisiana State Police stood in the threshold, accompanied by a man in a sharp gray suit who held a leather binder. The man in the suit looked directly at me. He did not offer condolences. He simply asked me to step out of the room, informing me that the Financial Crimes Division needed to ask me a few questions about my miraculous return from the dead. I sat in the back of an unmarked black sedan. The heat of the French Quarter faded as the heavy doors slammed shut, replaced by the freezing, sterile air conditioning of the vehicle. No one spoke during the 90-minute drive up Interstate 10 toward Baton Rouge. I watched the swamp pass by through the tinted glass. The cypress trees draped in Spanish moss looked like ghosts standing in the murky water. I assumed we were going to a precinct so I could file a report against my family. I assumed I would sit at a desk, give a statement, and let the authorities arrest my brother and my mother for stealing my life insurance policy. I was dangerously naive. They brought me to a bleak concrete building near the state capitol. They guided me through a maze of narrow corridors and placed me inside a stark interrogation room. The walls were cinder block painted an institutional white. A single metal table sat bolted to the linoleum floor. I sat on a rigid metal chair, my wet boots leaving muddy footprints on the polished tiles. I waited for 20 minutes, shivering in my damp clothes. The door clicked open. The man in the gray suit walked in carrying a thick manila folder. He introduced himself as a lead investigator for the corporate fraud division of the firm, underwriting my federal grant policy. Close behind him was a local detective. The detective wore a rumpled tan suit and carried a styrofoam cup of dark coffee. He introduced himself as Detective Landry. When Landry spoke, the words rolled out thick and syrupy, carrying the deep, rhythmic cadence of the Acadiana parishes. Landry did not pull out a notepad. He leaned against the cinder block wall and took a slow sip of his coffee. He told the corporate investigator that this entire mess crossed multiple parish lines. He threw out jurisdiction codes, citing statutes from Orleans Parish down to St. Martin. He explained that the initial fraud occurred where the death certificate was filed, but the financial theft crossed into East Baton Rouge, where the probate accounts were managed. The corporate investigator frowned, clearly frustrated by the labyrinth of local Louisiana law. The suit tossed the manila folder onto the metal table. He unclasped the metal rings and spread a series of financial documents in front of me. I leaned forward, expecting to see evidence of my mother's guilt. Instead, I saw my own face printed on a university grant application next to a timeline of the insurance payout. The investigator sat across from me, folding his hands. He did not offer a comforting tone. He stated that the $750,000 policy had been cashed out with unprecedented speed. He said corporate red flags had triggered an internal review days ago because the paperwork moved too fast for an international disaster claim. They were already building a case. Then my dramatic return pushed the investigation into federal territory. I nodded, feeling a brief surge of relief. I told them my brother Lucas must have forged the documents. I urged them to check the dental records. I explained that I had been trapped in Thailand without cell service and had fought my way back the moment I realized what happened. The investigator did not write down my defense. He stared at me with calculating, cold precision. He leaned across the table and accused me of orchestrating the entire scheme. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I asked him to repeat what he had just said. Landry stepped forward, placing his coffee cup on the table. He laid out their theory with a slow, deliberate drawl. He pointed out that my father was drowning in debt from his failing crawfish boat business. He noted that my brother had defaulted on high-interest loans for a bourbon distillery. My family was on the verge of total financial ruin. Then miraculously, the youngest daughter goes off the grid in a remote Asian province during a natural disaster. The family swiftly files a death claim, bypassing standard waiting periods. The money clears probate, saving the family empire. And right as the funds are secured, the supposedly dead daughter magically reappears in the French Quarter, creating the perfect alibi to claim she was a victim all along. They believed I hid in the jungle on purpose. They believed I faked my own death to split $750,000 with my bankrupt relatives. A suffocating paranoia gripped my chest. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in around me. I was not the victim in their eyes. I was the prime suspect in a coordinated wire fraud conspiracy. The investigator tapped his pen against the metal table. He informed me that the federal government treats insurance fraud over $500,000 as a major felony. The reality of the American legal system crashed down on my shoulders. I was facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I tried to control my breathing. I told them about my career. I explained that I was a respected wetlands ecologist. I had spent years earning my master's degree, securing federal grants, and building a reputation in the scientific community. I asked them why I would throw away my entire life's work just to bail out a brother who had failed the bar exam 3 times, and a mother who valued country club memberships more than her own children. Landry shook his head. He said people do desperate things when their blood is on the line. He asked me to prove I had 0 contact with my parents during those 3 weeks. He demanded evidence that I had not sent a burner email or a coded message authorizing the fraud. I had no proof. My original phone was buried under feet of mud in a Thai river. The backpacker who loaned me money was gone. I was sitting in a freezing room with a cheap prepaid cell phone and temporary travel papers. I had nothing but my word, and my word currently belonged to a dead woman. The investigator slid a plastic evidence bag across the table. He demanded I hand over all my digital devices. I hesitated, the legal terror paralyzing my hands. Without a phone, without an internet connection, I would have no way to access my university colleagues or contact an attorney. I would be entirely cut off from the world. Landry warned me that if I did not cooperate voluntarily, they would hold me in a cell and secure a warrant. I reached into my pocket. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the cheap prepaid phone I had purchased during my layover. I dropped it into the plastic bag. The investigator sealed the plastic with a sharp, ripping sound. They told me I was free to leave the building, but I was not permitted to leave the state. They informed me that my movements would be monitored. The investigation was moving into its next phase, and I remained their primary target. I stood up from the metal chair. My legs felt hollow. I walked out of the interrogation room and navigated the maze of cinder-block corridors until I reached the heavy glass doors of the precinct. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun of Baton Rouge. The oppressive humidity wrapped around me like a wet blanket. I was stranded in the capital city with no money, no phone, no legal identity, and the crushing weight of a federal indictment hanging over my head. My family had not just stolen my life insurance. They had framed me for their crime. I had to find a way to clear my name before the government locked me in a cage for the next 2 decades. I realized the only way to save myself was to confront the woman who had started this entire nightmare. I needed to look Julianne in the eye and force her to tell the truth. I began the long, humiliating walk toward my parents' sprawling plantation-style home on the outskirts of the city, unaware of the terrifying secret my mother was keeping inside those walls. I walked for 3 hours through the sweltering heat of Baton Rouge. The soles of my boots dragged against the cracked pavement. Without a phone or a single dollar in my pocket, I had no way to call a cab. I navigated by memory, heading toward the affluent suburbs on the edge of town. The sprawling, moss-draped oaks lining the boulevards offered brief reprieves from the blinding sun, but the humidity remained a suffocating weight. Every step I took amplified the terror of the federal investigation. I needed answers. I needed a confession. I needed to stand in my childhood home and force the woman who gave birth to me to explain how she could discard my existence so easily. I reached the rusted iron gates of the Broussard family property. The house was a classic Louisiana plantation-style estate featuring wide wrap-around porches and tall fluted columns. From a distance, it projected the image of deep generational Southern wealth. It was the image Julianne cultivated obsessively for her high society friends. But up close, the reality was starkly different. The white paint on the columns was peeling in large flakes. The grand front lawn was overgrown with thick crabgrass. The wooden steps of the porch sagged dangerously under my weight. The facade was crumbling, just like the family inside. I pushed open the heavy front door. It was unlocked. The grand foyer smelled of lemon polish and old, stale air conditioning. The house was dead quiet. There was no chaotic aftermath from the interrupted funeral. There were no weeping relatives or hushed, frantic meetings. I found Julianne in the kitchen. She was standing by the stove, stirring a large cast-iron pot of chicken and sausage gumbo. The rich, spicy aroma filled the room, a scent tied to every holiday and Sunday dinner of my childhood. Julianne did not look like the polished, calculating real estate broker who had commandeered the pulpit hours ago. The designer morning hat was gone. The pearls were removed. Her immaculate black suit was wrinkled, and her makeup was completely washed away, leaving her face pale and lined. She looked hollowed out. She looked like a woman who had spent the last hour staring into an abyss. She heard my footsteps and slowly turned around. We stared at each other across the expanse of the kitchen island. I braced myself for an attack. I expected her to scream at me for ruining the funeral. I expected her to berate me for attracting the attention of the state police. I dug my fingernails into my palms, ready to unleash my own fury, ready to demand she go to the precinct and clear my name. Julianne did not scream. She picked up a ceramic bowl, ladled a generous scoop of steaming gumbo into it, and walked slowly around the island. She set the bowl down on the wooden kitchen table in front of me. She pulled out a chair and collapsed into it, her shoulders slumping, as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. It was not the theatrical, manipulative wail she had performed at the altar. It was a raw, guttural weeping that shook her entire frame. The sound struck me like a physical blow. The towering, venomous rage I had carried since Thailand faltered, replaced by a jarring and unwelcome surge of conflicted sympathy. I stood frozen near the doorway. I demanded she tell me why she forged the death certificate. I demanded she explain why she cashed out my federal research policy to fund Lucas's failing business. Julianne looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and desperate. She told me I did not understand the danger. She claimed the situation was not about funding a business. It was about saving lives. Her voice trembled as she revealed the terrifying reality of Lucas's debts. He had not secured a traditional bank loan for the boutique bourbon distillery in the French Quarter. He had been rejected by every legitimate financial institution in the parish. Desperate Lucas had turned to violent cartel-affiliated private lenders operating out of New Orleans. She said Lucas had borrowed $500,000. He defaulted on the payments months ago. The lenders did not send collection notices. They sent men to the house. They cornered my father Beau near the docks in the Atchafalaya Basin. They physically threatened him, warning that if the debt was not paid in full, they would kill Beau and seize the ancestral home as collateral. The family was facing immediate violent ruin. Julianne wrung her hands together, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. She explained that when the typhoon hit Thailand and I went completely dark, the terror had already broken her. She watched the news reports detailing the catastrophic death tolls. She waited weeks for a phone call that never came. She genuinely believed I was dead. She believed the floodwaters had taken her youngest daughter. Then the realization struck her. The key person policy. a massive untouched reserve of capital tied to an unrecoverable body overseas. She viewed the $750,000 not as a theft, but as a divine miracle. A gruesome, tragic miracle that could save her living child from the mob and protect her husband from murder. I stared at her, the thick scent of the gumbo making my stomach churn. I listened to the justification pouring out of her mouth. She was defending fraud as maternal salvation. Julianne's gaze lost focus. She stared past me, her mind drifting backward. She spoke rapidly, the trauma of her past bleeding into the present. She recounted her childhood in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. She described growing up in grinding, brutal poverty. She talked about the gnawing ache of starvation, surviving for days on nothing but cheap white bread soaked in dark corn syrup. She described the deep, burning humiliation of coming home from elementary school to find the parish marshals throwing her mother's stained mattress and meager belongings onto the hot pavement because they had been evicted again. She told me she swore a blood oath to herself that she would never return to the streets. She clawed her way into Baton Rouge high society, building an empire of luxury real estate, all to outrun the phantom of that eviction. She looked at me, her face slick with tears, and stated that the prospect of losing the estate and watching her family become destitute was a fate worse than death itself. She had sacrificed my legacy to protect her golden child because poverty was the only monster she truly feared. A profound disgust warred with the agonizing ache of a daughter who just wanted to be loved. I realized my mother was not a mastermind sociopath. She was a deeply broken woman whose unhealed trauma had poisoned her morality. She had weaponized my tragedy to soothe her own terror. The emotional dam inside me finally broke. I had survived a Category 4 typhoon. I had been detained as an imposter. I had faced federal investigators threatening me with 20 years in prison. I had crashed my own funeral. I had held it together through sheer adrenaline and spite. But standing in my childhood kitchen, listening to my mother rationalize my erasure, the exhaustion overwhelmed me. I dropped into the chair across from her. I buried my face in my arms on the wooden table and began to cry openly. It was a messy, pathetic breakdown. I did not deliver a sharp, cinematic speech condemning her actions. I did not threaten her with the authorities. I wept with the raw vulnerability of a child. I looked up at Julianne, my vision blurred with tears. My voice cracked as the deepest, most humiliating truth tumbled out of my mouth. I told her that when I pushed open those church doors, I did not want to fight. I told her I just wanted her to drop her script, run down the aisle, and hug me. I just wanted my mother to be happy I was alive. Julianne stared at me, the devastation settling deep into her features. She reached across the table, her trembling hand hovering inches from mine. But she did not touch me. She knew the distance between us was no longer measured in miles, but in the permanent, irreversible damage of her choice. Before either of us could speak another word, a heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed from the front of the house. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, authoritative strike of law enforcement. Julianne's hand retracted. The terror returned to her eyes. The investigators had not finished dismantling our lives. They had simply moved to the next phase of the operation, bringing a suffocating financial panic that would strip away the very wealth my mother had committed a felony to protect. The heavy knocking at the front door shattered the fragile, tear-soaked silence in the kitchen. The Louisiana heat pressing against the windows suddenly felt suffocating. Julianne flinched, pulling her hands back into her lap. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, the raw vulnerability of my breakdown hardening back into survival instinct. I pushed my chair back and walked toward the foyer. Two men stood on the sagging wooden porch. They were not the state police who had brought me in for questioning. They wore sharp, nondescript suits and carried thick leather briefcases. One of them held up a gold badge. He introduced himself as an agent with the Federal Insurance Fraud Division. He did not ask to come inside. He simply handed me a thick stack of legal documents stapled together with a grim official weight. He informed me that as of 1 hour ago, a federal judge had authorized a comprehensive asset freeze. The investigators had placed a hard lien on every single financial account connected to the Broussard family name. That included my father's commercial shrimping accounts, my mother's real estate escrow funds, my brother's business holdings, and my own personal checking and savings accounts. The agent explained that because the $750,000 payout had been distributed rapidly among family members, the government was seizing control of the entire financial network to prevent capital flight during the ongoing wire fraud investigation. I stared at the paperwork in my hands, the legal jargon blurred together. I tried to explain that I was the victim, that I had been stranded in Thailand, that my mother had just confessed to orchestrating the payout to pay off cartel debts. The federal agent remained completely unmoved. He stated that until my legal status was officially reverted from deceased to living, and until I was definitively cleared of co-conspiring in the fraud, my assets would remain locked. He advised me to secure legal counsel immediately. Then he turned and walked back down the driveway, leaving me standing in the oppressive humidity, holding the documents that sealed my financial ruin. I turned back toward the kitchen. Julianne was gone. She had retreated deep into the house, unable to face the reality of the federal agents on her porch. Any lingering empathy I felt for her childhood trauma vanished. Her desperate need to protect her wealth had resulted in the absolute destruction of my own. I walked out the front door, down the cracked pavement of the driveway, and back out into the blinding Baton Rouge sun. The immediate reality of having zero access to capital set in fast. The cheap prepaid phone in my pocket had minimal minutes left. I had the temporary travel document from the consulate, but no valid driver's license. I was a ghost, trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. I needed basic supplies. I had not showered in days, and I desperately needed food and clean clothes. I walked 2 miles to a local strip mall and entered a discount grocery store. The air conditioning inside provided a sharp, brief relief from the punishing heat. I grabbed a plastic handbasket. I moved quickly through the aisles, selecting a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a cheap toothbrush, and a bar of soap. I approached the checkout counter, avoiding eye contact with the cashier. I pulled out my debit card from the credit union. It was the same card the consulate clerk had allowed me to test days ago. I slid the plastic into the chip reader. The terminal beeped a harsh metallic denial. Declined. I tried it again, my heart rate accelerating. Declined. The cashier looked at me with an expression of weary impatience. I asked her to run it manually. She typed the numbers. A red warning message flashed across her screen. She slid the card back across the counter and informed me the bank had placed a hard lock on the account. She asked for another form of payment. I stood there empty-handed, the smell of cheap floor wax and old produce turning my stomach. I had a master's degree in wetlands ecology. I had managed 6-figure federal research grants. I was a respected professional. Now I was standing in a discount grocery store, unable to purchase a loaf of bread. I walked out of the store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me, sealing me back into the brutal Louisiana summer. I found a shaded spot near a dying palmetto tree and dialed the customer service number for my credit union using my prepaid phone. After waiting on hold for 20 excruciating minutes, a representative confirmed the worst. The federal lien had triggered an automatic freeze. My accounts were not just locked pending probate anymore. They were actively seized under suspicion of federal fraud. I had zero liquid assets. I had no emergency fund. The financial independence I had meticulously built over 7 years of academic grind was completely annihilated. I needed shelter. I could not return to my parents' crumbling estate. I refused to sleep under the same roof as the people who had sold my life for a payout. I scrolled through the limited contacts I had manually saved in my temporary phone. I called Sarah, a former university colleague who lived in Lafayette about an hour away. Sarah was a fellow ecologist who had helped me tag alligators during our graduate studies. She was pragmatic, tough, and fiercely loyal. I explained the situation in sharp, breathless sentences. I told her I was legally dead under federal investigation and completely broke. Sarah did not ask for a dramatic retelling. She simply told me her address and said the garage was open. I spent the last of my borrowed backpacker cash on a cheap bus ticket out to Lafayette. Sarah lived in a small, weathered shotgun house near the edge of the university campus. Her garage was uninsulated, filled with stacked boxes of field research equipment, muddy waders, and the lingering scent of stale swamp water. She set up a twin mattress on the concrete floor and handed me a clean towel and a plate of leftover red beans and rice. I ate the food silently, the indignity of my situation burning in my chest. For the next 2 weeks, my life deteriorated into a humiliating routine of survival. The crushing heat of the unair-conditioned garage made sleep almost impossible. I woke up every morning drenched in sweat, the heavy air thick with the buzzing of cicadas outside the thin wooden walls. I needed an income source immediately to afford legal representation and basic necessities. I walked to the local university biology department where Sarah worked, hoping to secure a temporary research assistant position. I had the qualifications. I knew the faculty. The department head, Dr. Aris, recognized me instantly. He had attended my funeral. The shock on his face when I walked into his office mirrored the chaos at the church. He listened to my explanation, his expression shifting from disbelief to deep concern. He agreed to hire me as an independent contractor for a short-term water quality study in the basin. It was a lifeline. It was a chance to earn clean money and regain a shred of professional dignity. He handed the paperwork to the University Human Resources Department. 3 hours later, I was called back into his office. An HR representative sat next to him looking deeply uncomfortable. She slid my application back across the desk. She explained that the mandatory background check had triggered a massive systemic failure. My Social Security number was hard-coded as deceased in the federal database. Furthermore, the search revealed active red flags from the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Insurance Fraud Division. The university could not legally employ a dead woman who was actively under investigation for a RICO violation. To hire me would violate multiple federal compliance laws regarding their own grant funding. The lifeline was severed before I could even grab hold. I walked out of the university campus, the brutal sun beating down on the asphalt. The bureaucratic nightmare was absolute. I was trapped in a legal purgatory where I could not work, I could not access my own money, and I could not prove I existed. I had hit rock bottom. That evening, I sat on the stained mattress in the sweltering garage. I realized that my mother's desperate attempt to save the family from poverty had forced me directly into it. I had spent my entire adult life trying to outrun my parents' toxic obsession with wealth and status, only to be dragged down into their financial ruin. But as the sweat cooled on my skin, the paralyzing panic morphed into a bitter, hyper-focused resentment. Julianne had confessed to the fraud, claiming she did it to save Lucas from a violent cartel debt. She had traded my life to protect her golden child from loan sharks. I needed to know exactly what kind of monster my brother had borrowed money from. I needed to understand the threat that justified my erasure. I decided to track Lucas down and confront the reality of the danger he had brought upon our family, completely unaware that the truth I was about to uncover would shatter the final illusion of my mother's tragic sacrifice. The unair-conditioned garage in Lafayette had become a pressure cooker of resentment. The nights were long, sticky with humidity, and loud with the rhythmic buzzing of cicadas. Every time I closed my eyes on the thin twin mattress, I pictured Julianne weeping in her kitchen, defending her fraud as an act of maternal salvation. She had sacrificed my legal existence to protect her golden child from violent cartel loan sharks. The more I thought about it, the more the narrative felt unbalanced. Lucas was a coward. He failed the state bar exam 3 times because he could not handle the pressure of the testing room. He was not the type of man who navigated the criminal underworld. He was the type of man who ordered expensive scotch on a Tuesday afternoon and charged it to my father's credit card. Have you ever sacrificed your own sanity to protect a sibling, only to realize they were perfectly fine watching you burn? I needed to see the danger for myself. If my brother was truly running from hitmen, he would be deep underground. He would be changing locations, scrubbing his digital footprint, living in a constant state of paranoia. I borrowed Sarah's rusted Toyota sedan, promising to return it by midnight. The drive from Lafayette to New Orleans took 2 hours down Interstate 10, giving me plenty of time to build a mental profile of the cartel thugs I was expecting to encounter. I imagined armed men staking out his apartment. I imagined finding him hiding in a cheap motel in Metairie, terrified and desperate. I parked the sedan on a side street near the edge of the French Quarter. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and frying seafood. I walked toward the address associated with his boutique bourbon distillery project. It was a high-end, newly renovated bar on Royal Street, boasting exposed brick walls, vintage Edison bulbs, and a clientele dressed in tailored linen suits and designer cocktail dresses. It did not look like a front for organized crime. It looked like a networking hub for the city's elite. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The air conditioning was aggressive. Jazz played softly from hidden speakers. I scanned the crowded room, expecting to find Lucas huddled in a dark corner booth. Instead, I found him standing at the center of the mahogany bar. He was holding court. He wore a crisp, light gray tailored suit. His hair was perfectly styled. He held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid, gesturing expansively as he told a story to a group of men wearing expensive watches and confident smiles. I recognized two of the men from local news broadcasts. They were prominent city council members known for expediting commercial zoning permits. Lucas was not hiding. He was hosting a party. I watched him raise a hand and casually signal the bartender to bring another round of top-shelf bourbon for the group. He pulled out a sleek black corporate credit card and slapped it onto the polished wood. My stomach plummeted. The federal asset freeze had locked all the accounts connected to the Broussard family name. But here was Lucas buying expensive drinks for politicians. He had successfully diverted the insurance funds into a hidden corporate account before the federal agents could slap their lien on the family assets. He had insulated his own wealth while letting my accounts burn. I did not march up to the bar and create a scene. I had learned my lesson at the church. I needed a private confession, not a public spectacle. I walked quietly to the edge of the group. I caught his eye just as he finished his story. The smug confidence dropped from his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and suddenly much older. He excused himself from the councilman with a tight, forced smile. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly weak, and hurried me out the side exit into a narrow, damp alleyway, smelling of sour garbage and wet cobblestones. He pushed me against the brick wall. His eyes darted toward the street, checking if anyone had followed us. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I had secured legal counsel for the federal fraud charges currently destroying my life. He hissed at me, demanding to know what I was doing, ruining his networking event. He told me I was supposed to be keeping a low profile while the lawyers sorted out the probate mess. I pushed him back hard, my hands shoved against the expensive fabric of his suit. I demanded he tell me about the cartel. I asked him where the hitmen were. I asked him how he could stand at a bar buying expensive liquor while our mother sat in a crumbling house terrified that armed men were going to murder our father over $500,000 in debt. Lucas stared at me, genuinely confused. He blinked rapidly, processing my words. Then a slow, condescending smirk spread across his face. He let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. The sound echoed off the damp brick walls. He asked me if Julianne actually believed that story. The heat drained from my body. I demanded he explain himself. Lucas leaned against a dumpster, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked entirely relaxed. He admitted that there was no cartel. There were no violent loan sharks from the New Orleans underworld threatening to seize the family estate. The $500,000 in debt was real, but the lenders were aggressive private equity guys from a boutique firm in the central business district. They wore suits, not ski masks. They sent threatening legal notices regarding foreclosure, not armed men to the docks. The threat of physical violence was a complete fabrication. He took a sip from the crystal tumbler he had carried out of the bar. He explained the mechanics of his manipulation with chilling casualness. He said Julianne had always been terrified of poverty. She spent her entire life trying to outrun the memory of her childhood eviction in the 9th Ward. Lucas knew that if he just told her he made a bad business deal, she would lecture him and cut him off. But if he convinced her that violent criminals were going to murder their father and burn down the plantation home, her trauma would override her morality. He deliberately stoked her deepest, most visceral fears. He let her believe the family was in mortal peril. When the typhoon hit and I went off the grid, he saw the ultimate opportunity. He convinced Julianne that the key person policy was their only salvation. He pushed her to initiate the rapid probate process using her high society connections to expedite the paperwork. He orchestrated the entire illusion using our mother's raw psychological wounds to maneuver her into committing federal wire fraud on his behalf. I felt physically sick. My vision swam. Julianne was not the mastermind sociopath I had imagined her to be. She was a pawn, a deeply broken woman manipulated by the son she worshipped. I asked him what he did with the $750,000. If he did not pay off the private equity firm, where did the money go? Lucas smiled a wide, triumphant grin that made my skin crawl. He admitted he used a small portion of the payout to settle the immediate threats of foreclosure on the family estate, just enough to keep the creditors quiet. The rest of the money, nearly $600,000, he diverted into an untraceable LLC. He used the stolen funds to double down on his failed business venture. He purchased a massive, overpriced commercial warehouse in the highly sought-after Garden District. He bought the real estate outright, insulating the asset from the federal freeze. He used my life insurance policy to buy himself a bourbon empire, leaving me destitute and our parents legally exposed. He stepped closer to me, the smell of expensive alcohol sharp on his breath. He told me that this was just business. He claimed the family would eventually reap the benefits of his success once the distillery launched. He told me to go back to Lafayette, stay quiet, and let the lawyers handle the fallout. He casually patted my shoulder, adjusted his tie, and turned to walk back into the air-conditioned comfort of the bar. I stood alone in the damp alleyway. The betrayal settled deep into my bones, heavy and absolute. My brother was not a victim of circumstance. He was the true architect of the fraud. He had sacrificed his mother's freedom, his father's pride, and my legal existence, all to fund a vanity project. I realized I could not confront Julianne with this truth. She was too fragile, too brainwashed by her golden child. I needed someone who could corroborate the timeline. I needed the one person who had been physically present when the fake documents were signed. I needed to find my father, hoping he possessed the integrity his son so clearly lacked, entirely unaware that the final layer of the family's deception was waiting for me out in the murky waters of the basin. I left the French Quarter and drove Sarah's rusted sedan deep into the Atchafalaya Basin. The transition from the polished bricks of the city to the wild, untamed edge of the Louisiana swamps matched the unraveling of my own sanity. I needed the one person who had always stood apart from Julianne's high society obsession. My father, Beauregard Broussard, was a third-generation crawfish fisherman. Hurricanes and economic downturns had decimated his fleet over the last decade, leaving him with one aging boat and a crushing burden of shame. But he was still the man who taught me to navigate the murky waterways. He was the man who pointed out blue herons nesting in the cypress trees and taught me to respect the delicate balance of the ecosystem. I drove to the docks hoping to find the father I remembered, the quiet, principled man who would help me expose my brother's lies to the authorities. I parked on a gravel shoulder near the edge of the water. The evening air hung thick, saturated with the harsh industrial smell of diesel fuel and the organic rotting scent of pluff mud. Heavy moss-draped live oaks cast long, jagged shadows over the dark water. Beau's boat, the Evangeline, sat tethered to a weathered wooden piling. The hull was stained with rust and salt. I found him sitting on the aft deck in a worn canvas folding chair. He stared out at the black current holding a brown glass bottle of local Abita beer. The yellow light from a single halogen bulb illuminated the deep, exhausted lines etched into his face. I climbed aboard. The metal deck clanged loudly under my heavy boots. Beau looked up. His eyes were red and bloodshot. He did not look surprised to see me. He reached into a plastic cooler resting beside his chair, pulled out another Abita, and held it out to me. Cold condensation dripped down his calloused fingers. I took the bottle. The glass felt freezing against my warm palm. I sat on an overturned plastic milk crate opposite him, the physical distance between us feeling like an unbridgeable canyon. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him about my encounter with Lucas in the French Quarter alleyway. I detailed how Lucas used the life insurance payout to purchase a commercial warehouse in the Garden District, securing his own wealth while abandoning the rest of the family to the federal asset freeze. I explained how Lucas manipulated Julianne, exploiting her childhood trauma by inventing a fictitious cartel threat to secure her cooperation. I laid out the entire betrayal, expecting my father to stand up in righteous fury. I expected him to curse his son's name and promise to march into the state police precinct to testify on my behalf. I waited for the patriarch of the family to finally protect his daughter. Beau took a slow, agonizing pull from his beer. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his rough, scarred hands. A low, wretched sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of a man crumbling under the weight of his own guilt. He looked at me, his face glistening with tears, and delivered the final devastating blow to my understanding of our family. He told me Julianne did not forge the death certificate affidavit. The United States consulate required the signature of a direct legal next of kin to expedite the overseas probate process. A sibling could not push the paperwork through the bureaucratic channels fast enough. Lucas procured the fraudulent dental records through his shady private equity connections, but Lucas could not sign the final federal forms. Only a parent could do that. Beau looked down at the rusted metal deck. He confessed that he was the one who walked into the government office. He raised his right hand. He swore under oath, under penalty of perjury, that his youngest daughter had perished in the Thai floodwaters. He signed the paper that legally ended my existence. The cold glass of the beer bottle slipped slightly in my grip. I asked him why. I asked how the man who taught me to fish in these very waters could stand before a judge and swear I was dead. Beau cried harder, his broad shoulders shaking in the humid air. He explained the daily agony of watching his wife unravel. He said the bankruptcy of his fishing business had pushed Julianne to the brink of a nervous breakdown years ago. When Lucas presented the fabricated cartel threat, Julianne spiraled into sheer catatonic terror. She stopped eating. She paced the plantation house all night, suffering severe panic attacks about returning to the poverty of the Ninth Ward. Beau felt entirely responsible for their financial ruin. He believed his failure as a provider had broken his wife's mind. He looked at me with a pathetic, desperate plea for understanding. He said he could not bear to watch the woman he loved lose her sanity. When Lucas offered the insurance payout as a lifeline, Beau saw a way to buy back his wife's peace. He admitted he chose to appease Julianne's trauma over defending my life. He chose his marriage over his daughter. He traded my identity to purchase a fragile, temporary quiet in his home. The rationale was cowardly. It was an astonishing display of weakness. The last pillar of my family foundation shattered, leaving nothing but dust and ash. The visceral grief I had been carrying morphed into a blinding, white-hot fury. I stood up so fast, the milk crate skidded across the metal deck with a sharp screech. I looked at this man, this hollow shell of a father, and every ounce of professional restraint I had clung to evaporated. Next to my boot sat a heavy plastic bucket filled with shrimp bait. I drew my leg back and drove my boot into the bucket with every ounce of strength I possessed. The thick plastic cracked open. Foul, rotting fish heads and brine exploded across the boat deck, splattering against the rusted winch and the wooden railing. Beau flinched, pulling his arms over his head to shield himself from the mess. I reared back and hurled my unopened glass beer bottle directly into the dark, murky water of the bayou. The heavy splash fractured the quiet night, sending ripples out into the darkness. I turned back to my father and screamed. I did not yell. I screamed until the sound tore at my vocal cords, leaving my throat raw and bleeding. I called him a coward. I told him he sold my soul to subsidize his own financial failures. I demanded to know how he slept at night, knowing he had traded his living child for a paper check. He stayed cowering in his canvas chair, sobbing into his hands, unable to look at me. He offered no defense because there was no defense left to give. He had surrendered his integrity long before I ever stepped foot in Thailand. I stood on the deck, my chest heaving, pulling in ragged breaths of the heavy swamp air. I realized no one in my family was going to save me. My mother was blinded by her own unhealed trauma. My father was paralyzed by cowardice and shame. My brother was a calculating predator who viewed all of us as disposable assets. The authorities already viewed me as a co-conspirator. If I wanted to clear my name, unfreeze my accounts, and avoid a federal prison sentence, I would have to destroy my family myself. I turned my back on the weeping fisherman. I walked off the boat, my boots stomping down the wooden dock toward the borrowed car. I needed to return to the federal investigators in Baton Rouge. I needed to offer them a deal, fully aware that saving my own life meant leveraging the very environment I had dedicated my life to protecting. I was going to build an acoustic trap designed to capture my own brother's confession, using the intricate recording technology I utilized to monitor the swamps, turning the predator into the prey. I drove Sarah's rusted sedan away from the Atchafalaya Basin in a numb clinical haze. My throat throbbed from screaming on the deck of my father's shrimping boat. The heavy, grief-stricken tears I had shed in Julianne's kitchen were gone. The devastating betrayal by my father had burned away the last remnants of my familial loyalty. I no longer viewed the Broussards as my blood. They were simply a hostile entity blocking my path to survival. As the dark silhouette of the swamp faded in the rearview mirror, a cold, focused resolve settled over my mind. The next morning, I secured a meeting at the regional field office for the Federal Insurance Fraud Division. It was located inside a featureless beige building off Airline Highway in Baton Rouge. There were no official seals on the glass doors, just a suite number printed in plain black font. The corporate investigator and Detective Landry sat across from me in a cramped conference room, smelling of cheap toner and stale coffee. They spread a printed flowchart across the laminate table. The chart mapped the flow of the $750,000 payout. Bold red arrows pointed directly from the insurance underwriter to Julianne, as the executor to Beau, as the verifying next of kin, and finally to my frozen bank accounts. Lucas was noticeably absent from the graphic. The investigator tapped a pen against the paper. He laid out the bleak reality of my situation. The United States Attorney was preparing to convene a grand jury. My parents were facing imminent federal indictments for wire fraud and perjury. Because my name was on the initial policy, and I had miraculously reappeared just as the funds cleared, the prosecution intended to name me as a primary co-conspirator. I leaned forward, pointing to the blank space on their chart where my brother should have been. I told them Lucas orchestrated the entire scheme. I explained the fictitious cartel threat he used to manipulate our mother and his subsequent purchase of the commercial warehouse in the Garden District. Landry shook his head, taking a slow sip from his styrofoam cup. He explained the harsh mechanics of financial law. Lucas had insulated himself perfectly. He did not sign the death certificate. He did not file the probate paperwork. The funds he used to purchase the warehouse were funneled through a blind LLC structure. On paper, Lucas was just a grieving brother who received a legitimate business loan from his wealthy, grieving parents. To the federal government, Julianne and Beau committed the crime, and I was the ghost who helped them do it. I felt a sharp wave of nausea at the thought of sending my own brother to a federal penitentiary. It went against every instinct I had been raised with. But my alternative was spending the next 2 decades in a concrete cell for a crime that wiped out my own existence. I refused to let his greed dictate my future. I looked the investigator in the eye and offered to wear a wire. I volunteered to walk into a room with Lucas and get him to confess to the fraud on tape. The investigator let out a dry, dismissive sigh. He explained that federal wiretaps are not issued on a whim. They require mountains of probable cause sworn affidavits and the signature of a federal judge. The bureaucratic process takes weeks, sometimes months. I did not have months. The asset freeze would bankrupt me long before a judge reviewed the file, and the grand jury was already moving. The federal agents could not help me. I was going to have to bypass law enforcement entirely. I walked out of the beige office building and drove straight to the public library in downtown Lafayette. I logged onto a public computer and began researching the state legal code. I needed a loophole. I needed a way to capture my brother's voice without waiting for a federal warrant. Within an hour, I found exactly what I needed in the Louisiana Revised Statutes. Louisiana operates under a one-party consent law for audio recording. The statute dictates that it is legal to record a private conversation as long as at least one person involved in that conversation gives active consent. I was that one person. I did not need an FBI agent sitting in a surveillance van. I did not need a judge's signature. Any audio I captured myself would be fully admissible in both state and federal court. I left the library and returned to the stifling heat of Sarah's garage. I stared at the stacked plastic bins containing my field research equipment. The federal government had frozen my bank accounts, but they had not seized my ecological gear. My work in the wetlands required precision audio capture. Tracking the migratory patterns of the endangered dusky gopher frog involved isolating a singular faint mating call amidst the overwhelming ambient noise of a thriving swamp. To achieve this, I utilized highly specialized acoustic telemetry. I opened a heavy black Pelican case and retrieved a microparabolic transmitter. The device was no larger than a standard lapel pin. It was encased in a durable, waterproof resin shell designed to withstand torrential rain and deep humidity. It possessed an omnidirectional receiver that could filter out background wind and water noise, focusing entirely on human vocal frequencies. It was a piece of technology far superior to standard police-issue recording equipment. Now I faced a new logistical hurdle. I needed a way to wear the transmitter in plain sight without arousing suspicion. Lucas was arrogant, but he was also highly paranoid about his new wealth. If I showed up wearing a bulky jacket in the middle of the summer heat, or if he noticed a wire running under my collar, he would shut down instantly. The camouflage had to be flawless. I dug through a cardboard box of leftover apartment items Sarah had stored in the corner. I found a tangled knot of plastic parade beads. The city was gearing up for the festival season. While Mardi Gras was still weeks away, early parade routes were already beginning to roll through the streets of New Orleans, and wearing gaudy, colorful beads was a ubiquitous part of the local uniform. I selected a thick, multi-layered necklace featuring heavy purple, green, and gold plastic medallions. I took a small craft knife and carefully hollowed out the back of the largest center medallion. I nestled the microparabolic transmitter inside the plastic casing, securing it with a thin layer of clear epoxy. I routed the microscopic antenna wire along the inner string of the beads, making it virtually invisible to the naked eye. The device looked like a cheap piece of tourist trash. In reality, it was a high-fidelity acoustic trap. The final and most dangerous obstacle was the psychological warfare ahead of me. Lucas was a law school dropout. He had failed the state bar 3 times, but he had still spent 3 grueling years studying criminal defense and contract law. He knew the precise rhythm of a legal deposition. He knew how to spot a leading question. If I walked up to him and asked directly if he forged the dental records, his legal training would kick in. He would recognize the interrogation tactic and refuse to answer. I had to craft a dialogue strategy that bypassed his legal defenses and targeted his crippling narcissism. Lucas loved to feel superior. He had spent his entire life living in the shadow of my academic achievements, resenting my grants and my university standing. Now he finally held the upper hand. He was the wealthy business owner, and I was the destitute sister sleeping in a garage. I knew that if I acted terrified, confused, and desperate for his guidance, his ego would override his caution. I could not interrogate him. I had to beg him to explain his genius to me. I had to ask him to teach me how he navigated the probate court so brilliantly. I pulled out my prepaid phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I composed a text message designed to stroke his vanity. I told him the federal agents had questioned me, and I was terrified of going to prison. I told him I did not understand the legal paperwork and begged him to meet me in New Orleans to help me figure out a defense strategy. I hit send. The trap was set. My brother believed he was going to meet a broken, frightened woman seeking legal advice from the smartest man in the family. He had no idea he was walking into a high-stakes acoustic snare, orchestrated by a scientist trained to capture the most elusive predators in the dark. My prepaid phone buzzed a mere 10 minutes after I sent the bait. Lucas agreed to meet. He did not suggest a quiet, discreet location to discuss federal fraud. He told me to meet him on Bourbon Street at the height of the early Mardi Gras parade season. His choice of venue was a glaring testament to his arrogance. He believed the sheer volume of the festival crowds would provide the ultimate acoustic cover against any potential eavesdropping. He assumed the blaring trumpets and cheering tourists would render a standard police wire entirely useless. He was severely underestimating the capabilities of swamp ecology tech. I drove into New Orleans the following evening. The city was a pulsing, chaotic organism. The thick, humid air was saturated with the smell of spilled beer, sweet beignets, and the metallic tang of brass instruments. Neon signs buzzed and flickered above crowded sidewalks. I parked Sarah's rusted sedan several blocks away and walked toward the French Quarter. I wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, aiming to look exhausted and defeated. Around my neck hung the gaudy, multi-layered strand of purple, green, and gold plastic beads. The heavy center medallion containing the micro-parabolic transmitter rested flat against my sternum. I reached inside my pocket and blindly pressed the activation button on my modified receiver unit. A tiny, imperceptible vibration confirmed the microphone was live and actively recording. The device automatically synced to a secure, encrypted cloud server maintained by the university's Environmental Research Department. Every sound I captured was instantly uploaded to a digital vault miles away. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The physical reality of wearing a wire against my own flesh and blood sent a cold wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. I navigated the crushing throngs of tourists and found the address Lucas provided. It was a high-end exclusive balcony bar situated directly above the main parade route. I climbed the narrow wooden staircase and pushed through the heavy velvet curtains into the VIP area. Lucas stood near the edge of the wrought iron balcony. He wore a crisp, tailored linen suit that looked painfully expensive against the backdrop of the sweaty festival crowd below. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid, leaning casually against the railing, watching the parade floats roll past. I approached him slowly, keeping my shoulders slumped and my gaze averted. I needed to perform the role of the terrified, broken sister seeking the wisdom of her highly educated older brother. Lucas turned and looked me up and down with open, undisguised condescension. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and smirked. He did not ask how I was holding up under the weight of the federal asset freeze. He casually remarked that my current attire was a far cry from the prestigious academic wardrobe I usually sported. I swallowed the burning urge to scream at him. I maintained my defeated posture and told him I was terrified. I kept my voice shaky and breathless. I explained that the federal investigators had shown me the flowcharts mapping the life insurance payout. I confessed I had no idea how the legal system functioned and begged him to explain how he managed to insulate himself so perfectly from the incoming indictments. The strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. The chaotic roar of a passing high school marching band swelled from the street below, providing the perfect cover. Lucas checked his surroundings, noted the deafening noise, and leaned in closer. His ego, starved by years of academic failures and professional rejections, eagerly grabbed the bait. He laughed a sharp, arrogant sound that carried clearly into the hidden microphone resting against my chest. He took another sip of his drink and began to outline the entire criminal conspiracy with chilling, unprompted detail. He leaned against the railing, looking down at the cheering crowds, and happily confessed to orchestrating the international fraud. He boasted about the sheer genius of his timeline. He explained that a standard missing persons declaration overseas takes years of bureaucratic red tape. He told me he bypassed the wait by securing a high-interest payday loan, wiring the cash directly to a corrupt local official in Chiang Mai, and paying him to falsely identify an unrecognizable flood victim using my stolen driver's license data. I let out a fabricated gasp of horror, urging him to continue. I asked him how he managed the stateside paperwork without alerting the probate judges. The dramatic irony was thick and suffocating. Lucas gloated extensively, savoring the sound of his own perceived brilliance, entirely unaware that he was digging his own grave with every syllable. He proudly detailed how he manipulated Julianne's deep-seated poverty trauma to secure her cooperation. He laughed as he described the fictitious cartel threat he invented. He told me he let our mother pace the plantation home in absolute terror, believing armed men were coming to murder our father just to pressure Beau into signing the fraudulent death certificate affidavit at the consulate. I asked him about the money. I needed him to explicitly state the diversion of the federal funds to solidify the wire fraud charges. I asked him how he managed to purchase the Garden District warehouse without the federal agents freezing the capital. Lucas chuckled, swirling the ice in his crystal tumbler. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling sharply of expensive alcohol. He explained the mechanics of his blind LLC structure. He detailed the exact routing numbers and the offshore shell accounts he used to clean the $600,000 he siphoned from the insurance payout. He bragged about letting Julianne and Beau take the fall as the named executors, while he secured the real estate asset under a fictitious corporate name. He admitted explicitly and proudly that he used my life insurance policy to fund his boutique distillery, leaving our parents legally exposed to federal racketeering charges. Every word he spoke was captured in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. The parabolic transmitter effectively filtered out the crashing cymbals and pounding snare drums of the parade below, isolating the precise, damning frequency of his voice. I stood there listening to the golden child of the Broussard family joyfully confess to destroying my life and framing his own parents. The satisfaction of capturing the evidence warred with the agonizing realization of his complete lack of empathy. I had exactly what I needed to clear my name and hand the federal investigators the true architect of the fraud. I prepared to make a quiet exit, planning to tell him I needed to use the restroom before slipping out the back door and driving straight to the authorities. I took a slow step backward, my hand moving subtly toward my pocket to power down the receiver. Suddenly, a loud, chaotic scuffle broke out in the crowd directly below our balcony. Several drunken tourists shoved against the wrought iron barricades. The sudden movement caught Lucas's attention. He leaned sharply over the railing, his eyes tracking the commotion on the street. As he shifted his weight, the overhead lighting of the balcony shifted. The bright neon glow of a nearby daiquiri stand reflected directly onto my chest. The harsh light caught the edge of the hollowed-out plastic medallion hanging around my neck. It illuminated the tiny metallic glint of the micro-parabolic antenna wire running along the string of the cheap Mardi Gras beads. Lucas froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face. His eyes locked onto the glowing piece of environmental technology resting against my sternum. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sudden violent realization. The high-stakes acoustic trap I had meticulously built was exposed, and I was standing mere inches away from a desperate cornered man holding a heavy crystal glass. The neon light from the street below cast a harsh, unforgiving glare across the balcony. Lucas stared at the center medallion of the gaudy Mardi Gras beads resting against my chest. His eyes tracked the faint metallic gleam of the micro-antenna wire running up the string toward my collar. The transition in his demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The arrogant, untouchable golden child holding court with local politicians vanished. In his place stood a desperate cornered man who realized he had just delivered a full, unprompted federal confession directly into a recording device. His jaw tightened. The heavy crystal tumbler of bourbon slipped from his grip, crashing onto the wooden floorboards of the balcony and shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. The amber liquid splashed across our shoes, smelling sharply of alcohol and panic. He lunged at me. It was not a calculated cinematic strike. It was a messy, feral grapple born of pure self-preservation. He grabbed the front of my black t-shirt with both hands, his knuckles white with strain. He yanked me forward, slamming my back hard against the rough brick wall of the VIP section. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs. I gasped for air, tasting the sour stench of stale beer and sweat rising from the crowded street below. Lucas reached for the plastic beads around my neck. He did not care about the optics of attacking his sister in a crowded bar. The booming brass bands playing on Bourbon Street completely drowned out the scuffle, masking the violence from the other patrons, oblivious to our struggle. He gripped the hollowed-out medallion containing the parabolic transmitter and pulled with brutal force. The plastic string snapped, tearing the beads from my neck. The heavy medallion hit the floor, skidding across the wooden planks. He shoved me away and dropped to his knees, scrambling to grab the device. He snatched the plastic casing from the floorboards. His eyes darted around frantically until he spotted the cheap prepaid cell phone resting on a small cocktail table near the railing. I had placed it there to power the cellular uplink, connecting the transmitter to the secure server. Lucas grabbed the phone. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He shouted over the blaring music, his voice cracking with hysteria, calling me a rat. He accused me of destroying the family to save myself. He raised the phone high above his head and brought it down against the exposed brick wall with staggering force. The cheap plastic casing cracked. He hit it again and again. He hammered the device against the brick until the glass screen shattered into a fine, glittering dust and the internal circuitry splintered into pieces. He dropped the broken components onto the floor, stomping on the fragmented motherboard with the heel of his expensive leather shoe, just to be sure. He stood over the wreckage, his chest heaving, his immaculate linen suit now rumpled and stained with spilled bourbon. He looked down at the pulverized phone and let out a shaky, triumphant breath. He believed he had won. He believed he had destroyed the only physical evidence capable of sending him to a federal penitentiary. I stood leaning against the brick wall, my breathing ragged and shallow. The back of my head throbbed where it had struck the masonry, and my collar was torn, exposing the red, irritated skin on my neck where the beads had snapped. I looked down at the crushed cell phone on the floorboards. I looked back up at my brother. I did not scream for help. I did not cry out in frustration or beg him to reconsider his actions. The visceral panic that had gripped me during the physical scuffle evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical, and profoundly satisfying triumph. I straightened my torn collar. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my shirt. I looked at Lucas, his chest still heaving with the exertion of his violent outburst, and I let out a sharp, hollow laugh. The sound was flat and devoid of humor. It cut through the tension on the balcony like a scalpel. Lucas frowned, his confident posture faltering slightly. He demanded to know what was so funny. He pointed a trembling finger at the crushed phone, declaring that I had nothing left, that no judge would ever believe the word of a dead woman over a respected business owner. I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us. I kept my voice low, forcing him to lean in to hear me over the chaotic noise of the festival below. I explained to him that he had spent 3 years failing the state bar exam because he lacked the fundamental capacity to understand complex systems. I told him he approached legal problems with arrogance rather than intelligence. Then I clinically educated him on the mechanics of modern ecological technology. I informed him that microparabolic transmitters do not contain internal storage drives. The device hidden in the Mardi Gras beads did not possess a memory card. The equipment is designed to operate in hostile, wet environments where physical retrieval is often impossible. The transmitter functions strictly as a live relay unit. I pointed down at the shattered cell phone scattered across the floorboards. I explained that the phone was simply acting as a cellular hotspot. From the exact moment I activated the receiver in my pocket, the audio file was not being saved locally on the device he just destroyed. Every single syllable of his arrogant, detailed confession regarding the forged dental records, the fictitious cartel threats, and the illegal purchase of the Garden District warehouse had been actively streaming through a cellular uplink directly to a secure encrypted cloud server maintained by the university's Environmental Research Department. The blood drained from Lucas's face instantly. He stared at the crushed pieces of plastic and glass by his feet, the horrific realization settling heavily into his bones. I told him the recording had already been captured, locked, and time-stamped on a remote server located miles away in Lafayette. I informed him that the moment I walked out of this bar, I would log into that secure portal and forward the unedited audio file directly to the lead investigator at the Federal Insurance Fraud Division. The evidence was already out of his reach. He had just brutally assaulted his sister over a piece of useless plastic. Lucas stumbled backward, his knees hitting the wrought iron railing of the balcony. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his expensive shoes. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer a deal, but no words came out. The smug, untouchable architect of the Broussard family fraud had been entirely dismantled by a piece of swamp ecology gear. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on the golden child. I walked away from the shattered glass and the spilled bourbon, pushing back through the heavy velvet curtains and descending the narrow wooden staircase into the chaotic streets of the French Quarter. I had the confession. I had the leverage I needed to clear my name and end the asset freeze. But I underestimated the depth of my mother's broken devotion, completely unaware that Julianne was preparing to make a desperate, tragic move that would permanently alter the trajectory of the federal investigation and ensure the destruction of her own life. I drove back to Lafayette in silence, the adrenaline from the balcony confrontation slowly bleeding out of my system. The next morning, I used Sarah's secure university terminal to access the encrypted cloud server. I downloaded the audio file, burned it onto a sterile flash drive, and drove straight to the featureless beige building off Airline Highway in Baton Rouge. I handed the drive to the lead corporate investigator and Detective Landry. I watched their expressions shift from bureaucratic skepticism to sharp professional intensity as Lucas's arrogant voice filled the cramped conference room detailing the entire mechanics of the international wire fraud. I had delivered the true architect of the crime on a silver platter. I expected the grand jury to convene immediately. I expected federal marshals to surround the boutique bourbon bar in the French Quarter and drag my brother out in handcuffs. The federal legal system, however, is a massive grinding machine, and my mother possessed a desperate, terrifying intuition. 3 days after I submitted the recording, my temporary phone buzzed. It was Detective Landry. His usually slow, syrupy drawl was tight and clipped. He instructed me to come to the federal building in downtown Baton Rouge immediately. He did not explain why. He simply stated that a major development had occurred regarding the indictments. I arrived at the federal building an hour later. The structure was an imposing block of concrete and dark glass, projecting the severe, uncompromising authority of the United States government. Landry met me in the lobby. He did not ask how I was holding up. He guided me through the security checkpoints, leading me deep into the administrative wing, past rows of identical cubicles and harsh fluorescent lights. He brought me to a small, darkened observation room. A wide pane of one-way mirror glass dominated the far wall, looking directly into a stark interrogation chamber. I stepped up to the glass. Julianne sat at the metal table in the adjacent room. She wore a simple gray blouse and dark slacks. Stripped of the designer scarves and heavy pearl jewelry she usually utilized as armor. Her hair was pulled back into a severe utilitarian knot. She looked incredibly small, sitting under the bright interrogation lights. 2 federal prosecutors and a stenographer sat across from her, a thick stack of legal documents resting between them. I turned to Landry, demanding to know why my mother was here. I told him I gave them the audio, proving Lucas orchestrated the fake dental records and the financial diversion. I asked why they had not arrested my brother. Landry sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He explained that federal warrants take time to process, even with audio evidence. But Julianne had not waited for the warrants. She had marched into the federal building unprompted at 8 o'clock that morning, demanding to speak to the United States attorney. She had bypassed the investigation entirely and preempted the grand jury. I looked back through the glass. Julianne reached for a pen resting on the table. Her hand was surprisingly steady. Landry leaned closer to me, his voice dropping to a low, somber register. He outlined the devastating legal maneuver my mother was currently executing. Julianne was formally confessing to the entire criminal enterprise. She was signing a comprehensive, legally binding federal plea agreement. She claimed she was the sole mastermind behind the $750,000 wire fraud. According to her sworn statement, she manipulated Beau into signing the affidavit at the consulate by threatening to leave him and ruin his fishing business. She claimed she personally procured the forged Thai dental records using her connections in the international real estate market. But the most staggering lie was her defense of Lucas. She explicitly stated under oath that she forced her son to accept the illicit funds. She claimed Lucas believed the money was a legitimate inheritance payout and had zero knowledge of the fraud when he purchased the commercial warehouse in the Garden District. She was taking 100% of the blame. She was legally absolving both me and my brother, absorbing the full crushing weight of the federal charges onto her own shoulders. I pressed my hands flat against the cold observation glass. I watched my mother sign her name at the bottom of the thick plea agreement. The prosecutors collected the pages, their expressions unreadable masks of professional detachment. Julianne set the pen down. She folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead at the blank cinder block wall. A complex, suffocating grief seized my chest. The venomous anger I had carried since the Thai consulate began to fracture. I wanted her to face consequences for erasing my existence. I wanted her to lose the high society status she valued more than my life. But watching her sit in that sterile room methodically destroying her own freedom, I realized the terrifying depth of her brokenness. Julianne was not a cold, calculating monster. She was a tragic victim of her own unhealed poverty trauma. She had spent her entire adult life clawing her way out of the Ninth Ward building, a fortress of wealth and prestige, to ensure she would never face eviction or starvation again. Yet the moment she believed her golden child was in danger of going to a federal penitentiary, she willingly surrendered that entire fortress. She threw away her luxury real estate career, her social standing, and her liberty, all to guarantee that Lucas would retain his wealth and his freedom. She was walking into a prison cell to protect a son she believed was innocent. Tears spilled over my eyelashes, cutting hot tracks down my cheeks. I wept not out of forgiveness, but out of a profound, agonizing pity. I realized the agonizing irony of her sacrifice. She was throwing her life away for a lie. She genuinely believed Lucas was a good man who had stumbled into a bad situation with a violent cartel. She had no idea that Lucas had fabricated the entire mob threat just to secure funding for his vanity project. She did not know that her son viewed her as a disposable pawn, easily manipulated by her deepest fears. I turned away from the glass. I looked at Landry, my voice thick with unshed tears. I told him they had the audio recording. I told him they knew Lucas was guilty. I demanded they reject her confession and indict my brother. Landry shook his head slowly. He explained the harsh realities of the justice system. The audio recording was damning, but it was also messy. Defense attorneys could argue entrapment coercion or intoxication given the setting in a Bourbon Street bar. A federal trial against Lucas could take years and cost taxpayers millions with no guarantee of a conviction. Julianne, however, had just handed them a neatly packaged signed confession. She was the executor of the estate. She controlled the probate accounts. She fit the profile of the mastermind perfectly. The federal prosecutors were not going to reject a guaranteed conviction just to pursue a difficult, protracted case against her son. Julianne had effectively closed the investigation. The door to the interrogation room opened. 2 armed federal marshals stepped inside. They asked Julianne to stand. She complied, her movements stiff and mechanical. The marshals instructed her to place her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the audio feed into the observation room sounded final and absolute. I watched the marshals lead my mother out of the room. She did not look back. She walked with her head held high, marching toward her own destruction, sustained by the false belief that she had saved her family. I stood in the observation room long after the interrogation chamber was empty. The devastating reality of the situation settled over me. Julianne was going to federal prison. Beau was going to be left alone carrying the shame of his complicity. Lucas was going to walk away completely free, retaining the commercial warehouse he bought with my life insurance policy. My mother's sacrifice had ensured that the true architect of the fraud would face 0 legal consequences. I could not allow that to happen. I could not let Lucas sip expensive bourbon in the French Quarter while the woman who gave us life rotted in a cell to protect him. I needed to ensure that Julianne understood exactly what she had traded her freedom for. I prepared to request a private meeting with my mother in the federal holding facility, fully intending to play the Mardi Gras recording for her, completely unaware that exposing the truth would unleash a financial reckoning that would obliterate the final remnants of the Broussard family estate. The federal bureaucracy moved with terrifying efficiency once Julianne signed the plea agreement. The grand jury proceedings were immediately halted. The prosecutors secured their conviction without stepping foot in a courtroom. Within 48 hours, my mother was formally processed, fingerprinted, and stripped of the designer clothes that had defined her identity for 3 decades. The high society real estate broker was reduced to an inmate number assigned to the federal holding facility in downtown Baton Rouge, awaiting transfer to a long-term penitentiary. I had spent those 48 hours finalizing the reversal of my death certificate. With Julianne's sworn confession absolving me of any involvement, the Insurance Fraud Division lifted the holds on my identity. The probate courts formally nullified the fraudulent succession. The grueling legal roadblock that had kept me stranded in Sarah's unair-conditioned garage was finally dismantled. My name was restored, but my bank accounts remained frozen as part of the broader asset seizure protocol targeting the illicit funds. I could have walked away. I could have focused entirely on rebuilding my ecological research career and left my family to navigate the wreckage they created. However, the image of my mother sitting in that interrogation room stoically accepting federal prison to protect the golden child who played her haunted my waking hours. Julianne needed to understand the true cost of her sacrifice. She needed to know exactly who she traded her freedom to save. I contacted Detective Landry and formally requested 5 minutes alone with my mother in the holding facility before her final transfer. Landry hesitated, citing strict federal visitation protocols, but eventually yielded, acknowledging the bizarre and tragic nature of my specific victimhood. I walked into the holding area. The room was divided by a thick pane of reinforced, scratch-resistant plexiglass. The air smelled of harsh industrial bleach and stale sweat. Julianne sat on the opposite side of the glass. She wore a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit. Her wrists were secured in heavy metal handcuffs linked to a chain around her waist. The stark fluorescent lighting highlighted the deep exhaustion lines bracketing her mouth. The polished, unyielding matriarch who had commanded the pulpit at my memorial service was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a woman bracing for years of incarceration. I sat down on the hard metal stool facing her. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or demand apologies. The chaotic, dizzying anger I had felt at the church and in the French Quarter had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, clinical sense of closure. Julianne looked at me through the smudged plexiglass. Her eyes were dull, lacking their usual calculating spark. She leaned toward the small metal grate separating us and spoke, her voice raspy and thin. She told me she had fixed it. She claimed she had taken the blame so I could get my life back and so Lucas could keep his. She said she hoped I could find a way to move on, stating she had paid the ultimate price to ensure the family survived. I stared at her, absorbing the tragic irony of her delusion. She still believed she was the savior. She still believed she was the martyr sacrificing herself to protect her children from poverty and violence. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small portable tablet I had purchased after my identity was restored. I placed it on the counter directly in front of the metal audio grate. I looked her in the eye and told her she needed to hear the truth about the family she just threw her life away to protect. I tapped the screen and pressed play on the audio file I had downloaded from the secure university cloud server. The tinny, compressed sound of a booming Mardi Gras brass band filtered through the small speaker, immediately followed by the unmistakable, arrogant voice of my brother Lucas. The audio quality was pristine, capturing the exact cadence of his confident drawl as he leaned over the balcony railing on Bourbon Street. Julianne frowned, confusion furrowing her brow as she recognized her son's voice. She leaned closer to the grate, straining to hear the conversation over the background festival noise. The recording played Lucas's boastful confession. He laughed a sharp, cruel sound as he admitted there was no cartel. He explicitly stated that the violent loan sharks threatening to murder Beau and seize the plantation home were a complete fabrication. He described them as aggressive private equity guys from the Central Business District businessmen who sent foreclosure notices, not hitmen. Julianne froze. Her breath hitched audibly. Her shackled hands gripped the edge of the metal table, the chains rattling sharply against the steel. The recording continued. Lucas gleefully explained the mechanics of his manipulation. He detailed how he exploited her deep-seated trauma regarding her childhood in the Ninth Ward. He bragged about letting her pace the house in sheer terror, utilizing her visceral fear of poverty to maneuver her into initiating the fraudulent insurance claim. He chuckled as he described using my life insurance payout to purchase the commercial warehouse in the Garden District, securing his own boutique distillery while insulating the asset from the inevitable federal fallout. I watched my mother's face as the reality of Lucas's words hit her. The transition was agonizing to witness. The stoic, martyr-like composure she had maintained since her confession shattered entirely. Her eyes widened, filling with a frantic, uncomprehending horror. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She shook her head in short, jerky movements, physically rejecting the audio playing from the tablet. The recording ended with Lucas casually telling me to go back to Lafayette and stay quiet while the family reaped the benefits of his genius. The audio cut out, leaving only the harsh buzzing of the fluorescent lights in the holding room. Julianne collapsed forward, her forehead hitting the metal counter with a dull thud. Her shoulders heaved as a primal, agonizing sob tore out of her throat. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had fundamentally destroyed her own existence for an illusion. The golden child she had worshipped, the son she had prioritized over my life, had viewed her as nothing more than a disposable pawn. He had weaponized her deepest psychological wounds to fund a vanity project and then gladly allowed her to take the fall for the resulting federal felony. She looked up at me, her face slick with tears, her expression a mask of absolute devastation. She stammered, her voice cracking, asking if the recording was real. She begged me to tell her it was a manipulation, a trick to hurt her. I reached forward and turned off the tablet screen. I looked at her with profound pity. I confirmed the recording was authentic. I told her I had captured it days ago, before she marched into the federal building to sign her life away. Julianne slammed her shackled fists against the metal counter. She screamed for the guards. She yelled that she needed to retract her statement, that she needed to speak to the United States Attorney immediately to amend her plea agreement. She screamed that Lucas was the mastermind and that she had been lied to. I sat perfectly still, watching her desperate panic. I clinically informed her of the brutal reality of the legal system she had tried to outsmart. The comprehensive federal confession she had signed 48 hours prior was ironclad. She had sworn under oath that she acted alone, that she coerced Beau, and that she forced a completely innocent Lucas to accept the funds. The prosecutors had closed the investigation based on her sworn testimony. Retracting a signed federal plea agreement after it had been processed is nearly impossible, especially when the retraction involves accusing another family member to save oneself. The government had their conviction. They were not going to reopen a complex, multi-jurisdictional wire fraud case just because the convicted mastermind realized she had been played by her accomplice. The trap she built to secure Lucas's wealth had become her own inescapable prison. She had traded her freedom, her reputation, and her relationship with her daughter for a son who was currently drinking expensive bourbon in New Orleans, entirely unbothered by her incarceration. The heavy steel door behind her opened. 2 federal marshals stepped into the room, their expressions hardened against her frantic screaming. They grabbed her arms, hauling her upright. Julianne fought against their grip, her chains rattling violently. She looked back at me through the plexiglass, her eyes wide with a frantic, pleading terror. She screamed my name, begging me to help her, begging me to show the recording to the judge. I did not stand up. I did not offer reassurance. I simply watched as the marshals dragged her out of the holding room, her screams echoing down the concrete corridor until the heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off the sound completely. The silence that followed was absolute. I gathered my tablet, placed it back into my bag, and walked out of the federal building into the blinding Baton Rouge sunlight. The complex grief I felt was heavy, but it was accompanied by a profound clinical closure. I had not sought loud, messy revenge against my mother. I had simply presented her with the truth and let her own choices consume her. However, the consequences of the fraud were not limited to Julianne's incarceration. The federal government, having secured their conviction, immediately moved to execute the financial penalties outlined in the plea agreement, initiating a massive asset forfeiture protocol that would decimate the remaining Broussard estate and force me to make one final defining choice regarding the father who had abandoned me. 18 months have passed since the heavy steel door closed on my mother in that federal holding facility. The United States government operates with a slow grinding efficiency. The plea agreement Julianne signed triggered a mandatory asset forfeiture protocol designed to recoup the illicit funds and pay the required federal penalties. Federal marshals arrived at the sprawling estate in Baton Rouge on a humid Tuesday morning. They placed heavy iron padlocks on the custom mahogany front doors. Yellow seizure tape was stretched across the peeling white columns. Julianne had spent her entire adult life running from the trauma of her childhood eviction in the 9th Ward. She committed a federal felony to protect her elevated status. In the end, her crime resulted in the exact nightmare she feared most. The bank foreclosed on the property, and the state auctioned it off for a fraction of its market value. Julianne is currently serving a 5-year sentence at a federal correctional institution. She lost her real estate broker license. She lost her country club membership. She wears a standard issue uniform and adheres to a rigid daily schedule dictated by prison guards. I do not visit her. We exchange no letters. She chose her path in that interrogation room, and I respect the boundary she drew when she prioritized my brother over my freedom. Lucas did not fare much better. The federal prosecutors did not indict him thanks to our mother's sacrifice, but the financial division showed no such mercy. To satisfy the crushing restitution orders attached to Julianne's conviction, the government seized the commercial warehouse in the Garden District. Lucas lost his boutique distillery before a single bottle of bourbon was ever produced. Without the warehouse as collateral, the aggressive private equity lenders he had courted turned hostile. They demanded immediate repayment. Stripped of his family's wealth and facing imminent civil litigation, my brother packed a single duffel bag and fled Louisiana in the middle of the night. The last I heard from a mutual acquaintance, the golden child of the Broussard family was working as a shift manager at a retail electronics store in Ohio. He lives in a cramped rental entirely cut off from the aristocratic future he believed he was owed. While they lost everything, I methodically rebuilt my foundation. The probate courts formally nullified the fraudulent death certificate. The insurance underwriter restored my identity in their system, and the federal investigators cleared my name of all suspicion. My checking and savings accounts were unfrozen. The university reinstated my employment status and reauthorized my ecological research grants. I packed up my few belongings from Sarah's uninsulated garage and rented a quiet elevated cabin deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. The air out here smells of rich, damp earth and wild jasmine. It is a long way from the manicured lawns of Baton Rouge, and that is exactly why I chose it. There was one final piece of the family wreckage left to manage. My father Beau had stood by as a passive participant while his wife and son dismantled my existence. He signed the false affidavit because he was too weak to stand up to Julianne's terror. When the federal asset seizure swept through the Broussard estate, it did not spare him. The government placed a lien on his livelihood. His rusted commercial shrimping boat, the Evangeline, was impounded and scheduled to be sold at a federal maritime auction in Morgan City. Without his boat, Beau was facing his final years as a destitute day laborer, carrying the unbearable shame of a man who traded his daughter for a quiet house and lost both. I attended the maritime auction through a proxy. I hired a local environmental attorney to stand in the humid auction hall and bid on my behalf. When the Evangeline went up on the block, the attorney raised his paddle. Using a portion of my unfrozen savings and my restored academic grant stipends, I purchased the vessel outright. I did not buy the boat to hand it back to him as a grand gesture of forgiveness. I did not want tearful reunions or desperate apologies. I wanted permanent clinical detachment. I instructed the attorney to place the title of the vessel into a blind limited liability company named Acadian Marine Holdings. A few days later, the lawyer contacted my father. He offered Beau a unique arrangement. Acadian Marine Holdings was looking for an experienced local captain to operate the Evangeline and maintain its commercial fishing quota. The corporation offered to lease the boat back to him for a fraction of its operational value, allowing him to keep the majority of his daily catch profits. Bo accepted the offer immediately. The lawyer reported that my father wept in his office, his cell, expressing profound gratitude to the faceless corporate entity that had miraculously saved him from ruin. Bo wakes up every morning before dawn. He walks down to the misty docks, fires up the diesel engine of the Evangeline, and navigates the winding waterways of the basin. He works his traps, earns a modest living, and retains a small shred of his dignity. He has no idea that the daughter he legally declared dead is the sole proprietor of the company holding his lease. He does not know that I saved his livelihood. I prefer it that way. It was not an act of grace. It was a transaction. I purchased my peace of mind, severing the final thread of guilt that tied me to his failure. The sun is beginning to set over the Louisiana wetlands, casting a bruised purple and burnt orange glow across the sprawling horizon. I stand on the aluminum bow of my motorized research skiff, the engine cut drifting slowly through the dark mirror like water. The evening chorus of the swamp is starting to swell. Thousands of cicadas hum in a steady, vibrating rhythm. A bullfrog croaks in the distance. The thick curtain of Spanish moss sways gently from the branches of the ancient cypress trees, brushing against the surface of the water with a soft, lapping sound. It is incredibly peaceful out here. I think about the destructive force of the people who shared my blood. They spent their lives grasping for status, hoarding wealth, and treating devotion as a commodity to be bought and sold. They viewed me as a disposable asset. I did not have to wage a loud, vindictive war to defeat them. I did not have to scream my victories from a pulpit or tear them down in a courtroom. I simply introduced the truth into their fragile ecosystem and allowed their own insatiable greed to consume them. The trap they set for me caught them instead. I watch a white egret take flight from the marsh grass, its wide wings cutting a clean silhouette against the darkening sky. I did not fix my family. Some structures are too rotten to repair. Instead, I let them collapse, and from the debris, I took back my life. I sit on the wooden porch of my raised cabin as the last amber light drains from the Louisiana sky. The cicadas are deafening tonight, a steady, vibrating wall of sound that feels far more honest than any conversation I ever endured in my parents' grand Baton Rouge estate. It has been nearly 2 years since I walked into my own funeral smelling of dried river mud and aviation fuel, ready to tear down the elaborate illusion my family built over my empty grave. Looking back at the wreckage of the Broussard dynasty, I realized that surviving a Category 4 typhoon was merely a physical trial. Surviving the people who shared my blood required a different caliber of endurance entirely. Sitting here in the quiet isolation of the basin, I have had ample time to dissect the mechanics of my mother's betrayal and my brother's greed. Navigating that darkness forced me to extract 5 undeniable truths about human nature. First, I learned that unhealed trauma is an explanation, not a justification. Julianne's paralyzing terror of poverty was genuine, born from the brutal evictions she suffered as a child in the 9th Ward. But a deep psychological wound does not give you the right to bleed on everyone around you. You cannot demand someone else forfeit their legal existence just to keep your own demons at bay. Second, I discovered that true power rarely requires a raised voice. When I watched Lucas crush my decoy phone on that Bourbon Street balcony, believing he had outsmarted me, I learned that the most devastating response to narcissism is clinical detachment. When you stop fighting to be understood by people committed to manipulating you, their entire architecture crumbles. I did not need to destroy my brother. I just needed to hand him the rope and let him dig his own financial grave on a secure cloud server. Third, the concept of family is a biological accident. Loyalty is a conscious daily choice. My father, Bo, chose the path of least resistance, swearing under oath to a federal judge that I was dead, rather than facing his wife's escalating panic. I learned that shared DNA is not a binding contract for abuse. Setting a permanent, unyielding boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of supreme self-preservation. Fourth, the ordeal taught me the undeniable necessity of financial autonomy. When the federal investigators froze my accounts, stripping me of the ability to buy a simple loaf of bread at a discount grocery store, I understood that capital is not just currency, it is a shield. Securing my ecological grants, purchasing my father's shrimping boat through a blind trust, and rebuilding my career proved that you can only truly protect your peace when you hold the keys to your own livelihood. Finally, the hardest lesson of all, you must stop waiting for a genuine apology from people incapable of self-reflection. My parents will never grasp the true magnitude of their betrayal, because to do so would require facing the darkest, ugliest parts of their own souls. I had to learn to grant myself the closure they were fundamentally incapable of providing. I do not harbor hatred anymore. Hate requires a tremendous amount of energy, and my energy belongs to the wetlands, to my research, and to the hard-earned peace I fought so desperately to claim. I am Avery Broussard. I was declared legally dead, but I have never felt more alive. If my journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you in order to protect yourself, I want to hear your story. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand that altered the course of your life? Drop your experiences in the comments below. And if you found strength in this narrative, please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Olivia Stories Revenge. There are more tales of survival truth and reclaiming your power waiting for you. Thank you for listening, and remember, you alone hold the pen to your own story.